All right, welcome everybody. This is the first session for the study group on Marx's 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. I'm Daniel, very excited to host this study group. Let me just start off by saying a couple things. I've posted the PDF on the Patreon. I'll put the link in the chat. Hopefully everybody has it. The text that we're working with is this one here, translated by Milligan. Um, I am not too much of a specialist on these things, but I have heard that this is a solid translation. So unless somebody has like a really strong criticism of this, I propose that we use this translation. So that's number one. Number two, it's a short text. So in reality, I think we'll be able to finish the text in 3-4 sessions. And when we're done, what I was thinking in the meantime, I will actually identify like a guest or multiple guests that specialize on the early Marx, on Marxist humanism, on Marx and alienation to sort of join us to give like a talk, and we can have like a forum. We can even, if people want to present, say some of you are researchers and you're doing work on Marx's alienation, you can also reach out to me and say, hey, I'd like to present some of my research. That's also very welcome. Aaliyah encouraged me to create a Discord. So we have that for follow-up conversations, debates, discussions, things that come up. For example, I fell into a hole reading Althusser's Reading Capital today, because this very famous text, you may or may not know, takes on the 1844 manuscripts very, very centrally, right? And at some point, maybe not today, I might mention it. The significance of what Althusser claims about Marx's reading of Hegel vis-a-vis Feuerbach in the 1844 manuscripts are literally the basis by which Althusser says this is the old epistemological model that Marx is dealing with, and Capital constitutes a true rupture, right? Well, technically the theses on Feuerbach, which happened not too shortly after the 1844 manuscripts, interestingly, right? Because as a sort of historical background, Marx and Engels meet like around 1843, 1844. This text that we're about to look at from the position of political economy represents Marx's most rudimentary immersion into the study of political economy. The first few pages we're going to look at today, the first, I don't know, 45, 50 pages, are just long block quotes of his notes of all the liberal political economists that he's reading, mostly French, different political economists say, and mostly Adam Smith, right? And so nothing here from the position of political economy represents Marx's discoveries in Capital. So therefore, in a certain way, this is, I think, our first question of this text, right? And this is exactly what Althusser raises. The consequences by which Althusser takes that famously is what he calls the epistemological break. So anyways, we don't need to get into that, but there's a lot of secondary literature. So what I do want to do is sort of stick to the text as best that we can for these first few sessions, right? And the other thing I'll say is that I'm happy to function as like discussion leader, but I would also love if others would serve as discussion leaders in future sessions. That would be very welcome. I may like reach out for folks that may be interested in that. So that's our plan. Those are the logistics. I have some notes that I've put forward. I can either share my screen or just sort of share them with you and walk through them. Hopefully everybody has the PDF or the text in front of them. But let me pause and see if there's any thoughts on our general agenda. Um, and of course, maybe we have a group of about 20. So if anybody wants to jump in with thoughts on anything, literally, or just to say hello, I definitely recommend that you do so. Isaac, please.
Hey, yeah, I don't want to be kind of, I don't know if this is the right thing to say here, but I'm Isaac, and I just saw what had put out on Twitter, and I was interested to join. So I hope that it's all right that I'm here.
Of course.
Um, and I was just curious, though, if you could tell us a little bit about what your thinking was. I mean, maybe it's self-evident, and in putting the reading group together, and what your hopes are. Is that a fair
Well, I mean,
question?
it's a good question. It's a fair question. First of all, I want to understand the philosophical stakes of Marxism. And I think this is the text to start with, right? So I think that there is this question about how Marx relates to philosophy, and it must be answered by beginning with this text, right? That's number one. Number two, I want to look at the question of alienation today and reflect on the relevance of this, given that a lot of Marxists today um, are actually kind of the mind that alienation is not a central concept for Marx. Again, this text, I think, will be our guide for some determination on the centrality of alienation for Marx. Um, Third, I want to, I just finished a long reading of Capital and with a group called Class Unity. We started in September and we just ended. It's actually still going on, but we formally ended the main part of it. And so I want to reflect on the early Marx to the Marx of Capital, given that the Marx of Capital is somewhat fresh in my mind. So those are three agendas of mine. I think a fourth agenda of mine is, as somebody who was trained by Alain Badiou and very much steeped in French Marxism and French philosophy, the presence of Althusser is huge. And like I said just a moment ago, we should never underestimate how much I think this text, 1844 manuscripts, kind of comes under assault by the Althusserian school. And so I've assigned Meseros, um, who was recently introduced to me from an interview I did in my podcast with John Bellamy Foster. Um, was actually one of John Bellamy Foster's mentors. He was a Hungarian Marxist trained by Lukács, and he wrote what is considered the most important 20th century look at the concept of alienation in Marx. And I think it's called Marx's Theory of Alienation. I put the PDF in there. The first intro is all on the 1844 manuscripts because he confesses that the 1844 manuscripts were sort of like the text of post-Stalinist Marxism. Why? Well, first, because they weren't released, I think, until about the 1920s, was it? Somebody can check on that. That's number one. But number two, um, the there's something about state socialism and bureaucratic socialism that missed the problem of alienation or didn't touch it adequately in some sense. So it's not a surprise that that Stalinist period was that sort of Western Marxism, right, was obsessed with alienation. Um, like there was something about Marxism that remained very open, even if people made a definitive judgment on Marxism vis-a-vis Stalinism, right? So therefore, yeah, there's that question. And also, I mean, I could go on and on and on. I'm writing a book right now on Lukács, so I'm interested in it from that point of view. So I knew that I had to take this text seriously. And then finally, in a very practical sense, I don't know if Richard is here, but I have 1927 and 32. Thank you. Is it Cave? Thank you. I have a beautiful Richard. I'm doing. He is a grad student, and I'm advising him, and he's interested in alienation as well. He may or may not be here. So that was another. So I have many, many things, but please tell me what your interest is, Isaac.
Oh, I mean, m many interests. Some academic, some more political, and not really knowing. Yeah, I wanted to learn more about Marx and do more. I thought it would be interesting to do reading in collaboration with others, but it didn't necessarily extend much further than that. And I didn't know if you had a particular ideological angle that you wanted to explore, or if you
Right.
were, or if it was, was something a little more general than that. And so yeah, I didn't want to be intrusive, but I was just curious.
Perfect. That's a perfect question. That's I think you're in a good place. We're just really meant to do like a close reading and open discussion. So, Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And as much as I would consider myself a Marxist, I would say that my confidence in, explaining any concepts of Marx are, a little, uh, let's say, a little myopic compared to like my situation in Lacanian studies. So I'm going to treat you as the sort of subject supposed to know. And so yeah, and one of the thinkers, which is funny you mentioned reading Capital, one of the thinkers I'd say helped me structure my understanding of Marx was Althusser. And there is in the For Marx text his notion of the epistemological break
Right.
from his early works. But one of the thinkers that I feel like is kind of moving me away from that is Karatani, and I've been situating myself more with
Uh-huh.
the works of Karatani.
Yeah.
Um, it seems like he doesn't hold to this split or this epistemological break from what I understand, and it's more on this like notion of labor theory of value that is of concern. But I guess from what I'm trying to gather up here, uh, Marx's works are consistent even up till Capital, and it seems like even alienation never leaves. You probably maybe could see it in commodity fetishism, wouldn't you say, and in the analysis of the commodity.
Yeah. Well, these are all questions that we need to drill into because the question I think for Althusser was um, what is the significance of breaking with hate like this Feuerbachian way of understanding the essence of the human, right? Because Marx, in a sense, I mean, I think we should sort of historically situate where Marx is, what the young Marx is into. What is his situation in the world? Um, what is the context in which these manuscripts are derived? Are they are produced? They're produced in a very short period of time. There's something about them which is youthful. There's something about them that's like super ambitious. There is, according to Etienne Balibar, um, it constitutes a rupture in this sort of academic disciplines, right? So there's a kind of um, the beginning of what you might call a wager on behalf of Marx, that there is something about political economy for which political economy cannot see, for which all of the classical political economists are kind of asses to themselves in a way. Like if you read all of these opening block quotes, it sounds as if these guys, these political economists, are writing about a system of capitalism for which they already know is hopeless, right? Even he quotes Adam Smith, right? And we can go to these pages in a moment as basically showing that the uh, unacknowledged goal of capitalist society is the production of mass misery, right? So there's something fatalistic about the whole endeavor of political economy. Simultaneous to that, Marx is reading widely in political thought, political theory, Rousseau, Montesquieu. I mean, he's reading Machiavelli. He's reading the kind of contradictions in a post-French revolutionary context between the Rousseauian problem of the citizen versus man as a generic being, right? And it is this man as a generic being that becomes the sort of site for which political economy thinks that it has no true bearing on this question in some sense. So Marx, in a sense, is bringing a radicalized Hegelian understanding of the generic human into the field of political economy. And so he's radicalizing political economy from a philosophical point of view. But you see, I think it's important to understand that for Althusser, when he says epistemological break, one very simple way to understand that, and we don't need to talk about Althusser too much here, just because he came up, is that it's a mode of epistemology. It's a mode of epistemology at the time of the 1844 manuscripts, which argued that the knowledge of political economy was one of sight or non-sight. Adam Smith couldn't see the full totality of the system that he thought that he had mastered. But this is the wager. Marx didn't have a theory of fetishism at the time of 1844 in which he could logically deduce that non-sight of Smith, that what Smith couldn't see. It would only be later. But you see, the interesting point is that he has a premonition of it here. And the irony is that Marx was just introduced from a kind of sort of political biographical standpoint, by the way. He just meets Engels like a year before these lectures, or these notes in this manuscript here. Engels was the one who was doing all the political economy work, because Engels was on the cusp of publishing The Condition of the Working Class in England, which was actually the highest selling book in the Marx Engels repertoire for most of the time. Capital didn't do well when it first came out. It was too complex. Even though it was Engels that tried to make Capital do well, it took a while for it to set in. But it was this empirical data that Engels had put onto Marx. That's why the opening of this is just all of these notes of Marx, because Engels is giving him these like reams and reams of economists that he's having to read. And a lot of it also, by the way, is literally empirical snapshots of the horrors of the capitalist system in which Marx encounters it, right? Yes, Aaliyah.
Oh, I don't mean to interrupt. You can continue with the point that you're on. I guess, have a couple questions for later.
Yeah, I'll just say, sorry, I got a little feedback there. Please, you have questions. That's excellent. We're going to jump into the text in a moment, but these are just opening remarks. Because the Althusser thing is kind of like a big shadow. I think it does have to be addressed. So yes, Andrew, it has to do with the thesis of how Marx understands alienated labor. Because the most central category that will be developed by the next time we meet is alienated labor. That's what the political economist can't see. But when Marx develops a theory of fetishism later in Capital, it's a different positionality of epistemology in which the claim is made about how they can't see. It's different, a different logic. And that also represents a break from Hegel and Feuerbach, according to Althusser, in some sense. I know.
So
go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
Aaliyah.
Yeah. So I guess I have two questions and we can kind of tackle them as we see appropriate. They're both kind of related to what's being talked about right now. And I guess the first is much more simple, which I guess, I know, you talk about Lukács, and I'm pretty familiar with, his position, his work on alienation, and everything that kind of comes with that, huge part of his work. But I was curious if there were other like prominent or less prominent Marxist scholars who would conceptualize that break in a totally different way than Althusser would, or who would even reject that. So that was the first question. And I don't know if I want to just dump the second one right now or.
Sure.
And then I guess the second one is kind of more just a point of conversation that would be interesting to bring in, and I'm not sure if we plan to, but Connor in the chat is also pointing out, that it's really interesting how Marx is talking about, how the worker is reduced to machine. And in this first part of the text that we read today, he's kind of talking about, like, we haven't quite worked out if the workers are working through the machines or if they are working as machine. And I think that's something that and I've heard you talk about this in other things that I've seen you in panels and whatnot. Deleuze is really interested in this question. And I think that's kind of part of what, is maybe informing the thesis he tries to make later on, or at the very least, it, I don't know, kind of snowballs into where he goes. So I was wondering if that was something we maybe wanted to bring into this text too, or if it's maybe out of scope. That's all I have for right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of thinkers that both reject Althusser's theory of the epistemological break, but which that we can draw insight from. I definitely think that Lukács would be one of them. Bertel Ollmann, Luis, we'll go to you in a moment, or I'd like to hear you say more about that. So yeah, it's something though that I think. Let me actually do this for the Althusser piece. I'm going to put some excerpts from Reading Capital, since this has come up and I think it's useful. They're not going to be that long, but we can just read them to keep in the back of our minds so we understand the centrality of the 1844 manuscripts for his larger theory of the epistemological break from Hegel. Because it has everything to do with the novelty of the new science of political economy that's developed in Capital and what the consequences are from that, right? And I think also what the consequences are for Althusser, importantly, just as they are for Lukács. You see, because Marx at this time is developing a kind of immanent theory of praxis. When is the thesis on Feuerbach written? I think it's written just like 1 year after this. So I want to so note that the theses on Feuerbach are written 1 year after this, and then listen to a letter that Marx writes to Feuerbach a couple months before he writes the 1844 manuscripts. To Feuerbach, you have in your writings, whether intentionally or not, I do not know, given us a philosophical foundation to socialism. The unity of men with men, which is founded on the real differences among men, the concept of the human species brought back from the heaven of abstraction to the real world. What is this but the concept of society? That is 1 year before he and Engels write the theses on Feuerbach. Which is kind of funny if you think about it, because then that kind of makes you think the theses on Feuerbach are written by these, like, I don't know, like hysterical students. Marx and Engels, right? Against the master, right? And maybe that's true, right, Aaliyah? Maybe there is a bit of that. But then, of course, you have to read Engels's later reflections after Marx dies um, on Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy, which is an incredibly neglected but important text, where he reflects back on when they wrote the theses on Feuerbach in their 20s, around this time that we're talking about Marx. And he says, basically, it's amazing to think about it, but we were absolutely correct, even though we were like young radicals, young brats, so to speak. You know what I mean? Um, so I think actually when we're done, we should then read the theses on Feuerbach, right?
Right.
Yeah, I love that. That'd be great. And
You know what I
I
mean?
think you're right too, you know, that they have this in these theses, they have this excellent criticism. And I think, you know, I don't know that it's particularly neglected within the canon, but you know, I think that what sometimes gets lost along the way too is like how much they also like took from that, like how foundational that was, like that work was to their work. And that's, I feel like, you know, you can really see that in that letter. So that's really interesting and cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Sorry, the thing is, you know, like what we have developed here is a certain praxis developed around a particular standpoint in relationship to what? Well, by the time of Communist Manifesto, the argument of Lukács is that the novelty of what is developed of the Marxiological praxis, like what separates Marx from Feuerbachian socialism, what they call the true socialists, is understood in the totality of the standpoint of the proletariat, right? So it's this idea that the only position in society which can see, again, this knowledge, this epistemology of sight, I think Althusser is right, how he's functioning with truth as a social form of truth, is found in the working class proletarian position. This is the kind of early Marx par excellence. This is the pinnacle of the early Marx. And that position has to be radicalized and must be galvanized at the center of any revolutionary activity. Also as a knowledge claim, you see too. You see my point? It's not just a revolutionary tie. It's also a claim about philosophical knowledge. So anyways, Luis, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no. I put in I'm trying to understand dialectical materialism, so I was like, oh man, this is when I saw your post on Twitter, I was like, oh man, this is fantastic. Like, great. But two things, Alia, to your point, I'm just starting to read this now. It's called like A Dance of the Dialectic. It's by Bertel Ollman. And it's like it's as accessible as you're gonna get in terms of dialectical materialism, which is still like a slog to read, but he actually does talk a little bit about Althusser and like has criticisms of him, as well as like gives like some primary sources as to like how Marx thought about Hegel. And he still kind of liked Hegel even in the 1870s, but the reason why I'm here is because like I'm really interested to know like what happens, how does like our mindset and like our practice shifts when we like understand like alienation and fetishism, and what happened when that was lost due to the stuff happening in the 1920s and all that.
That's excellent. What do you mean by lost in the 1920s? What do you mean exactly?
Well, when you talk about like the sort of like rise of the Soviet Union and like the leadership of Stalin, like how does like a lack of understanding of alienation sort of like informs like their political practice? And how does like us
So
understanding that?
so yeah, I have an answer to that actually. Which is the Hungarian Revolution. Um So actually, that might be useful for us to do as a case study, because famously, the Hungarian Revolution is known, like famously known, as incorporating a praxis informed by this text that we're looking at. So that's useful, I think. Connor.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? And of course, thanks, Daniel, for hosting this. I have read like bits and pieces of the philosophical manuscripts before, but this is going to be the first time like actually reading it cover to cover. Uh, so hyped to do that with you all. But yeah, it was interesting just like reading through the first bits of what we've read today. It struck me like very clearly that this is like a project about human freedom, right? And like I think that's the mistake that these political economists are making, according to Marx, right? They are proposing their critique of political economy as the betterment of human beings, like in general. And Marx is saying that's true for some people, you know, like some people in the society are becoming more free, but you can only make such a claim if you misrecognize the misery of the workers, right? And we've already mentioned like dialectical materialism because of Louise, you know, those were some of the strongest moments in the reading today when he talks about exactly that critique, right? Like the dialectic of prosperity and misery in this sort of society, right? The betterment of capitalism can only happen if more and more people are completely deprived, right? So yeah, and I guess this is just a digression, but it's interesting. This point on like Marx says that workers like fall into the position of like animals or machines, and it's interesting to me because it doesn't seem as though he's settled on one or the other. Um, and it reminds me like because now we're talking about philosophy with a book like this. It reminds me of like Descartes' automaton, right? Like which is another word for like for machine, right? And very famously, the automaton for Descartes is an animal. So they're really like you know a certain philosophical tradition, like one and the same thing. But the crucial point is whether machine or animal, they're not free. You know, they're not free human beings. Um, so yeah, just talking aloud and hyped to get into it. Let's go.
Fabulous. Great interventions, great comments. Again, today's going to be just a sort of overview. We're not going to get into the meaty philosophical stuff, which really begins um, about page well, I think actually about page, what is it, 50 or so? So again, our first foray is sort of Marx. One way to think about the first 50 or so pages is Marx is sort of giving a like what do they call it when you do a PhD dissertation and you have to do an analysis of a field of literature? What is that called again for you PhD students?
Is that a
Review,
Pressy?
a literature review. Marx is giving a kind of literature review of the predominant political economists of his time. And he's quoting them. He says very little in these opening pages, as you'll notice. I mean, but what he does say is quite forceful, as Connor suggests. There's some strong claims. The first claim that I think must be noted here. I mean, obviously, there's the preface, which is not necessarily making any. It's very short, but he's just simply saying in the preface that I am bringing a Hegelian philosophical approach that has never been done before to the field of political economy. But what is of this literature review of the existing political economists that he's talking about? What are some things that are like noteworthy? I think the first is that capitalist society is founded on a fundamental schism between the worker and the capitalist, and that irrespective of the cycles of capital valuation, irrespective of capitalist boom and bust cycles, the worker is destined to suffer from the divisions that are inherent within the capitalist society. And these divisions are founded in certain spheres of the capitalist economic system. And the way that these spheres cannot and do not see one another as interconnected. This is actually what later in Capital Marx calls the Trinity formula. Ground rent, capital, and landed property. And the kind of law internal to these spheres is a law of competition, for which it's a losing game even amongst the capitalist class. You'll notice that he says frequently how much the capitalist class produces disaffected workers from its promises, which is actually an interesting sociological and historical side point about the type of capitalism that Marx was dealing with, which had direct bearing on how Marx understood the project of working class solidarity. For example, the large capitalists exploiting and putting out of business small capitalists would result in the families of those small capitalists, small business owners, what we would call today, to become disenfranchised for generations in some cases. And this would lead to what they call proletarianization, right? So if you read, for example, Jacques Rancier's incredible history of the workers' movement of the 19th century, you'll see that that fight within the capitalist class and the production of proletarianization actually produced a certain advantage for the working class. Why? Because in a sense, Rancière shows, and many, I think, historians have shown, that the political militancy of people in capitalist society who move rapidly from one class to another is palpable. And I think we know this firsthand empirically today. Like, if you yourself or your family has ever moved from a class, you'll know that it, from an experiential standpoint, you'll know that your own experience with alienation is much more visceral, I would argue. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I think that's the other thing to note here, is that Marx is not putting forward a vulgar theory of alienation and capitalism, which would fetishize the workers as somehow secretly containing some kind of beautiful soul, preserved status. No, he's saying that this is a chaotic system which is producing splits and divisions even amongst these various classes, and how even like rentier capitalists and landlords have all of these divisions and splits and disagreements with other forms of big capitalists, whether that be financial capitalists, productive labor, whatever. Sorry, go ahead, Aaliyah.
Yeah, this is kind of more just a comment. I suppose it's not like high theoretical, but I think that's, something that's so interesting. And I think you can even experience that kind of, that kind of alienation can really come to the forefront of your consciousness, even if you're not really the one like moving, up or down to a different class level. Like even in my life, like, working class, single mom, poor family, but I have been able to engage with, various different classes at different like social levels. And it's always kind of a game, that you kind of have to play. There's different rules, and it can even just, I feel like that feeling of alienation can be so strong, that feeling of, oh, I'm kind of out of place, and it's so affecting at like every level. And I think, there too is a lot of research that shows that, your work, you've spent a lot of time talking about family dynamics, social dynamics, through the lens of like psychoanalysis. And, there is a lot of, pretty good research that shows that one of the most difficult barriers for intimate couples, in sort of like romantic relationships or partnerships to get through successfully is the sort of class differentiations. Typically, individuals from one class have a harder time having successful, sustainable relationships with people from different class backgrounds. And I think that that's, a lot of that is probably just due to that sort of intrusion of alienation.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Yeah, it also must be said that Marx, in the text which we will read next week, wishes to say that the alienation of the worker in capitalism also produces what he refers to as a spiritual alienation. It's also important to say that Marx brings the category of suffering, even though Marx, as we probably know from a philosophical standpoint, is a great critic of the philosophical tradition known as utilitarianism, which puts the maximization and minimization of suffering at the very center of their understanding of social life. Marx is not interested in that as a metric for the determination of the betterment of society. However, he does clearly say that in general, on page 21, in quote, in general, it has to be observed that where worker and capitalist equally suffer, the worker suffers in his very existence. The capitalist suffers in the profit on his dead body, basically. So the question there is the qualification of what Marx means by existence. So now you can see why all of these crazy existentialist phenomenologists and those sorts of people are drawn to this 1844 manuscripts when Marx says things like that. Because in a sense, what he's saying is well, very profound, but also quite, it needs some systemization, which I hope to do next time. And also, which I really encourage you to read the introduction of Mezeros's book. But let's go to Tara, please.
Hi. First, I just want to say hi. I've never met you. I'm a big listener of the podcast. I come out of literary studies, and I was also at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College for a while. So, and they're obviously somewhat of an odd pairing, but I do think through her quite a bit and through the human condition in relation to Marx. One of the reasons I was drawn to this reading group is a couple of your recent episodes that I'm really constantly returning to the question of the role of ethics and a moral impulse in Marx. And even just starting this text, just the concept of misery is in a sense a moral concept. He's using language like avarice. And I think your last podcast that had like two thinkers on it, one which said, we have to have a conception of the good life in order to even begin or return to first principles. And the other interlocutor was coming from a much more sort of immediate site of struggle. And that was really speaking to my question that I keep returning to. And I feel like that does then go to your question about what is the philosophical drive. But I was also just more specifically in this moment, I'm actually not in the right edition at this moment, but in reading, I think it's in Estranged Labor, I was interested in the way that he moves from, he's talking about the misery of the working class, and then we need competition, but competition leads to monopoly, which is also a kind of nascent theory of imperialism, sort of via Lenin. But then he goes, and finally, the distinction between capitalist and land rentier, like that between the tiller of the soil and the factory worker, disappears, and that the whole of society must fall apart into the two classes, the property owners and the propertyless workers. And I found this presentation very interesting in terms of like re-articulating this connection between land rentiers and ideas of new feudalism today, and that I feel like we're almost flipping back into that having a greater valence. I don't know, just kind of putting them at equal sites and then saying that they collapse into each other, I found like very interesting in this moment as a configuration of the class struggle.
Yes.
So
That is
thank you for
so.
having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you, Tara. That's really great to have you. I mean, when I said before that Marx is offering a kind of wager on a future, almost like premonition or sort of research project that would culminate in capital, I think exactly what you just said about these divisions between the capitalist, the rentier class, landlords, and the way in which they both compete internal to one another, but also the way in which not one of them is master of the social relations in which they compete and for which they exchange commodities and so on. So it's a strange tiered system. And the issue is one, again, if we take Althusser's suggestion, which I think that we should in this instance, what Marx is interested in is who amongst the political economists is seeing the totality of the capitalist system. And his answer is that none of them are adequately seeing it, on the one hand, and these are the kind of researchers of political economy. They set themselves that task, but in a sense, they shy away from the horror of the system, which they only half acknowledge. In a sense, you almost say he's saying that Smith and Say and Sismondi and these other figures shy away from the horror of the system, in a certain sense. And I think that actually, in a way, could go back to an ethical question, in a way. Is there a revulsion on behalf of the political economists at the very subject that they are supposedly experts and masters in? And so I think you're completely right. And it is not yet developed, because exactly what it is that occludes is fetishism that we know in capital. It's the logic of fetishism. What is the meaning of fetishism but a covering over, right? So capitalist class relations are composed of different fetishized covering overs, right? And so what is it about working class experience that is not immune from fetishism? That would be ridiculous to claim that. Like the grand heroic worker or something. That's not the claim. The claim, though, is, I think, that there is, in political activity, the worker does possess some kind of relation to this fetishized totality that other class positions don't. And that interests me a lot. That claim interests me a lot. And I think a thinker like Lukács is also very interested in that claim. So this is a fabulous open conversation. This is like exactly what I wanted this group to be. So Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the breakdown of the or the overview of what we're going to be getting into. And I have, like, I guess a comment or a question concerning the first two chapters in this edition right here, because the first two chapters in this one are wage labor and wage of labor and profit of capital. And so it seems like in the relationship between the worker and capitalist, it's an antagonistic one, which he seems to focus on wages. And you broke down the whole thing about like how, he's not fetishizing the worker as something that has some special knowledge, but that they suffer in their existence in the beginning, because he says something about like how the worker struggles with wage and finding work, and even if the capitalist loses, the worker loses more. And then he goes into the second chapter talking about capital. But it seems, and my question is, when he says right here, what is the basis of capital, that is of private property in the production of others' labor? He says that it's by virtue a positive law. And can you elaborate more on what this positive law is? Because it's different from obviously capital in the capital text when he's analyzing the problem of the commodity form and value.
Yes, I think he's just quoting Adam Smith directly here. Again, this
Okay.
is different than what is developed in Capital for sure. So if you give us the page number, we can read the passage together.
Yeah, so it is on give me 1 second. It's the second chapter, page 35 in this edition, and it goes
Yep.
all the way up to the beginning of 36, where he describes capital as a governing power, governing law. And that's what my confusion was. I don't was his description was like an
No,
exegesis.
this is the political economist say. He's
Oh,
simply reiterating how this political economist understands the capitalist system.
mhm,
And so for many, many pages, Marx does not exert his opinion or his view, really.
mhm,
It's a recapitulation of the leading lights of contemporary political economists of his time, is
mhm,
what this section is about. But in a sense, he does have an implicit agreement with the laying out of
mhm,
it for the most part. Um, so in a sense, I think all that he means by positive law is that uh, that the capitalist system is, I think, generated off of a legal framework within capitalist society. I think that's in the grand sweep of things, a minor point, but we're going to go back and go systematically through the text. Tara, no, sorry, Takeen, please go.
Hi everyone. So what I was gonna say isn't really related to the question right now, but it was just a general thing that I thought would be interesting to do. So, like we've already mentioned, like a lot of people, Althusser, the reader of Marx that Andrew mentioned, I didn't catch the name, and even Marx and Engels themselves, in talking about the theses on Feuerbach, there's a tendency to sort of reclaim the young Marx within the mature Marx, the older Marx. But one thing I really enjoy doing is to actually look at the young Marx and see how he was always the old Marx. He was always this sort of quote unquote, to be Althuserian, he was always this sort of scientific thinker. But when I say scientific, I don't mean it in like a super contemporary sense. I think I mean it in a more Aristotelian sense, or even Hegelian sense, in the sense of like, what do you expect from the founder of science, who is probably Aristotle? He would say about man, right? Or humans. Like we were talking about, like we're not really sure whether workers are machines or whether they're animals, etc. And then Tara, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, also mentioned that there's a sort of moralistic element in the young Marx. Well, to me, it's much more Aristotelian. Marx is saying a human is a human is a human who acts humanly, pretty much. Like there's no sort of moral, not disagreeing with Tara, but I'm just giving my reading. There's no moral outlook on it. And that sort of brings young Marx back in with the old Marx, which is, I think it's an interesting way to read Marx. Maybe I thought it was useful to make this comment earlier rather than later. in these sessions. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Just like,
Yeah. I think the question of morality will come up next time, and the precise sort of point at which we can assess whether Marx can be understood as having a kind of moral claim in this kind of humanist Marxist text that we're looking at. But I think it might be good for us to sort of start and go through and just sort of flag as we go through key points in the text. Thank you all for your comments. So I felt that on page 20, where in the wages of labor, as we first sort of dig in here, the first sort of striking claim is that Marx says a few lines down that the demand for men necessarily governs the production of men as of every other commodity. Should supply greatly exceed demand, a section of the workers sinks into beggary or starvation. The worker's existence is thus brought under the same condition as the existence of every other commodity. The worker has become a commodity, and it is a bit of luck for him if he can find a buyer. And the demand on which the life of the worker depends on the whim of the rich and the capitalists. Should the quantity and supply exceed the demand, then one of the constituent parts of the price, profit, ground rent, or wages is paid below its rate. A part of these factors is therefore withdrawn from this application, and thus the market price gravitates towards the natural price as the center point. So he's still dealing with this kind of Smithian notion of Marx does not have a theory of surplus yet. And he does not have, like, he's dealing with Ricardo, but he's not really working with the labor theory of value yet. So a lot of this is a bit primitive for readers of Marx's Capital. But the point is that the existence of the worker, irrespective of the cycles of capitalism, is in a kind of condition of pauperization. Now, I think this is an interesting point of contrast, which a lot of like right-wing readers of Marx will always make this point, which is Marx has a sort of dated quality because the status of the worker in capitalism he's talking about is prior to, like, the Second Reich under Bismarck, when Bismarck introduced social welfare, right? And you see, because one of the things historically that's important to understand about the evolution of capitalism is after the Paris Commune, European nation states began to introduce things like minimal social welfare and things like charity amongst bourgeoisie. Charity was introduced earlier, but it became much more formalized, precisely to avoid this kind of Dickensian pauper existence of the proletariat. So we have that immediate question, which is that in Marx's time, the labor reserve army, right, the working class, was, in a sense, always victim to, you could call immense pauperization, intense pauperization, right? Or intense proletarianization. I'm kind of using those synonymously. And so that's an interesting point. I mean, it's a point of historical repetition in capitalism, of course, precisely because we know that pauperization and proletarianization still absolutely occurs today. So I wonder if how folks find that, because Marx, in a sense, is saying that capitalism has abandoned any notion of a kind of social welfare contract. This is how I read it, in some sense. So I don't know if that matters to folks, but that was one point that I found interesting. He goes on to talk about the fact that the worker receives no benefit from the increase of, even though he doesn't have labor theory of value and the different theories of how surplus is generated. Ultimately, it will be a theory that he elaborates that surplus is ultimately generated more through exchange. It's not generated as some left Ricardians argued, purely by the labor of the working class. In a sense, this is Marx at a very left Ricardian position, in some sense. So that I think is important. It's so intense. You read this on page 23. The raising of wages excites in the worker the capitalist mania to get rich, which he, however, can only satisfy by the sacrifice of his mind and body. The raising of wages presupposes and entails the accumulation of capital, and thus sets the product of labor against the worker as something ever more alien to him. So you see, in a sense, it's a lose-lose. It's a kind of it's a fatalist fate of the worker is dismal, miserable in some sense. So page 24, when there's a greater amount of product and there's overproduction, even when there is overproduction, this throws a large section of workers out of work, right? So capitalism eats its own tail. And I think that this is absolutely the case, right? Like we are living in the era of what, I don't know if you folks are familiar with this theory of the long downturn, right? The long downturn and the decline in the rise in real wages, right? So there is always this ambiguity in Marx, which is, and you see this in Marx's Capital on the, there's this kind of supplementary site of contestation amongst the ruling class, amongst the managers, amongst the bosses, for the kind of enforcement of the adherence to wage labor and the disciplining of adding more working hours and things like that, which requires relations of kind of like pure domination in some sense. In a sense, the Marx that we're dealing with has a theory of capitalism as pure domination. But as you probably know, for readers of Capital, what Marx ultimately will develop in Capital is sort of a theory that capitalism is most pernicious because it actually exchanges in relations of impersonal domination. So there's always that strange oscillation that has to be accounted for. And I think you could call like the question of real or actual domination like the political Marx, which I find very interesting and not talked about enough. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm thinking of, I totally agree with you when you say like we can think of this as a society of like total domination, but we could use another word that he emphasizes in the text as well. It's a society of like total dependency. And so far as the workers are totally dependent on the capitalist class. And with that being said, you earlier mentioned there's a lot of right critiques of workers being dependent on the welfare state. But that just reminds me of something that Tara was talking about earlier, this question of ethics, like in the text. Insofar as the workers are reduced to animals or machines, I don't think questions of ethics are applied to workers. You know what I mean? It's an ethical question for people who have freedom. You know what I mean? And this then modifies our earlier claim. It's only when you have workers who are dependent on the welfare state that you get to moralize workers, because this is a burden or something.
I like that, Connor. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, listen to this on page 27. When society is in a state of progress, the ruin and impoverishment of the worker is the product of his labor and of the wealth produced by him. The misery results, therefore, from the essence of present-day labor itself. Society is in a state of maximum wealth, an ideal, but one which is more or less attained, and which at least is the aim of political economy as of civil society. This means for the workers, static misery. So this is a true question in my view, because what we're dealing with here is a sort of long historical debate that I do think, Connor, changes once a welfare state is introduced in Germany and with different Bonapartist regimes, and then obviously after the Second World War. But it becomes a question around the following point, which is that this claim here doesn't change in Marx's Capital. You see my point. What changes is a new arsenal of a conceptual apparatus for workers to understand that reality. But that reality remains. So it's obviously a major assault on any reformist, liberal, compromised, socialist position. It's the reduction. I mean, in logic, it's almost a reduction ad absurdum in some sense. And that's like the forceful aspect of its logical strength as a claim. And also, it is also, I think, obviously a grand existential claim as well. So it's quite powerful. Society does not consider the worker when he is not working. This is a very important point. Society, and this I think is also absolutely essential. Society, and not only society, but the so-called experts of political economy on 27, don't see the man in civil society as interconnected as a worker, as a laborer. Like there's some, again, it's the fetishist logic, but there's some blind spot. Again, epistemology of sight is what's going on here. So this blind spot is what Marx calls abstract labor on page 27, which I think is the building up of one of his most first essential key points. What is the evolution of mankind is the meaning of this reduction of the greater part of mankind to abstract labor. So, please, Tara, please. Sorry, is it Tara?
It's actually Tara.
Tara, sorry.
Yeah.
My bad.
When I dip into Buddhism, it's Tara, but when it's just me from Long Island, it's Tara. Well, since my comment has been referenced a couple times, I mean, I really appreciate that, by the way, because it's already putting a lot of pressure on it. I guess I'm really reverting to a very basic gesture of like, why does anyone care and about the misery of the working class? And to care about the misery is, can we call that already a moral or an ethical project? Right? Because there's lots of libertarians who do not care, right? Who see the kind of mechanism of capitalism or accumulation as still the blah, 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 blah. And I know there's a big history to all of this that I'm still learning, but so it's not so much how society looks at the worker, but it's the impulse to embark on this project of looking at the worker as a human or not. And then I was just going to introduce, when we were talking about domination, Soren Mao's, mute compulsion came to mind, and I wasn't sure if that was, I think it would be very interesting to see if, I know that phrase comes from Capital, but if that is part of what we are sensing in this text is the kind of total sort of economic net that or dependency, as I think Connor said,
yeah.
If that's a kind of sort of incipient version of something like that. And then I just had the question of a kind of lumpen proletariat, like, which is a category that's always confused me. It's not just surplus labor, and it's not just laborers who are out of work. It's people who are really kind of at the fringes right? And are they already so beyond either society seeing them or being part of a category or an inclusion? They're not part of abstract labor, right? Or
No, they are. They are.
okay.
I mean, the best way to understand the category of the lumpenproletariat is that it is those workers who have a non-relation to productive labor,
Mm-hmm.
which is why when you have Napoleon take power, the distant cousin of the real the first Napoleon, after 1848 in France, his ascension was a lumpen ascension where the lumpen proletariat, because they had no reliance on factory productive modes of labor, who did they align with? They aligned with the finance aristocracy, who also shared that same non-relation to productive labor. And so it's a kind of theory in a sense of the standpoint of that relation within the class system that allowed, that's why the lumpen proletariat is the most dangerous class. Who are they the danger to? They're the danger to the interests of the working class, particularly the working class for whose occupations are tethered to productive labor. So they're still defined as laborers in some cases. Like, so for example, you can define the lumpen proletariat even in today's terms as basically those excluded from wage labor, or who but not entirely. In Clyde Barrow's work, which I've had him on my show, he's written this incredible new book on the lumpen proletariat, rethinking it completely. He puts forward some really compelling arguments about how to redefine it. Because I do think that it needs to really be reworked. Just like, the petite bourgeoisie is like all of these categories always need to be refined and rethought. But I guess to summarize what I'm trying to say is that I think they would qualify here, absolutely, as part of this broader substrate of mankind in relation to, but within that, the granularity is they have a different relation to productive labor. And therefore they pose a problem because strategically, it's not a moral claim about the suffering of the working class that Marx is interested in. It's a strategic claim about the overcoming of the capitalist mode of production and the sight of the worker in relationship to surplus generation, surplus profit and value, that makes them most decisive to any changing of the capitalist system. If anything, the lumpen proletariat, if they were organized according to their interests, would go to undermine the productive proletariat in some sense. So the task, according to Engels, and Engels is a better writer on the lumpen than Marx because he wrote more on it, is to bribe the lumpen, right? In the same way that you would bribe the petit bourgeois or the downwardly mobile petit bourgeois, in alignment with interests of the working class, in some sense. They're very much subject to bribery and the black market and forms of illegal exchange and things like that. So whereas the working class is disciplined in the kind of mainstream system of productive labor, and even within that system, Marx is making this beautiful claim, or this monstrous claim, that their misery stands out as most acute. Does that make sense? Yeah. Please, Kabe, please.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Kaveh. First of all, I want to say thank you, Daniel, and thank you for all folks. This is great session, and it's really a pleasure to drop in and really learning. I actually had a plan to read this text for a long time. I'm art historian and working modernist art, and one of the key aspects of modernism is alienation. It depends how you define, but at the end of the day, it's very much about the alienation. It's great to reading this text with you. Thank you very much. And in related to the last comments, I think Connor did a really great comments about this needs, this structure of needs, and also to the passage you mentioned down on page 27. I read that passage very much in terms of Moshe Poston's, domination, labor domination idea. I don't know how much my reading was right, but I was thinking this passage in terms of what you can see like in Hegel in civil society. It says like about the system of needs, which basically is market, right? This is civil society and this dependence base of the needs, right? And connecting this, I was trying to connect this to this idea of abstract labor you mentioned. Perhaps this is about the labor market. If trying to connecting this system of needs and this idea of abstract labor, to me that makes sense. That it's about labor market, right? The workers to survive, right? They need to sell their labor in the labor market, and this is the system of needs actually. I'm not sure that's my reading is to some extent is faithful to the text, but anyhow, I'm enjoying the conversation. Thank you.
Yes. This category is, we will learn in our next set of pages that we read, is also succumb to what Marx calls alienated labor. And alienated labor is part and parcel of wage labor and the system of wage labor. As we know on page 27, Marx makes an underhanded critique of Proudhon and of this notion of political economists who think that the setting of prices and wages can somehow ameliorate this condition of alienated labor adequately. And Marx makes a strong claim on page 27 that the raising of wages is not adequate. And this, of course, introduces one of those things that makes you want to pull your hair out on the socialist left, because you are immediately introduced to debates, which still exist to this day, around whether the condition of this alienated labor and the suffering that the wage labor system engenders, to what extent should we as political militants advocate or not advocate the increase and the betterment of those suffering conditions? Because you see, there's a certain cold and bleak way to read Marx's suggestion on page 27 against Proudhon. Oh, well, because there was two forms of revolution. There was political revolution and there was social revolution. Social revolution could, according to some socialists, be adequate to achieve the enfranchisement of the rights of workers and the degradation that they were experiencing vis-a-vis the wage system. Whereas Marx is really arguing that this social revolution of lifting the equality of the wage is not going to be adequate. And interestingly, of course, this thing, and the Jacobins learned the same thing. There's a very famous case of the Le Chapelier law, which you can study in the sequence of the French Revolution. I actually write about this in my Nietzsche book, where they tried to institute full equality of the wage, and the whole society fell apart, which is why some people argue that Marx's rebuke to both liberal and these kind of moralistic socialists and utopian socialists like Proudhon is that Marx is a thinker of freedom, not equality. And then the problem becomes, okay, well, what type of equality would we think of a social relation beyond wage labor? That's different than equality in capitalism. So it's a big debate that I'm obsessed with, that I always want to have with people, if that makes sense, which is yes. Well, rather, because you could walk away and you could think, well, yeah, Marx just wants this misery, this proletarianization to go all the way down to the bottom out point in which revolution becomes inevitable. But actually, yeah, I mean, I wonder what you all think about that. Some people do walk away with this idea. It's called the immiseration thesis, which kind of has two angles, right? Which one is that capitalism foments and produces immiseration. But I think there's another angle which I find problematic, which is that the praxis of Marxism should almost, in some sense, welcome immiseration. Or not welcome it, but does that make sense what I'm saying? Kind of almost like what's the use of advocating the increase of leisure for the working class? See, this introduces us to an important event which happens much later in Marx's life, which is the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune is interesting for Marx. Why? Precisely because this immiseration thesis hits an interesting point of realization, which is the working class seizes power. And for a long period of time, yes, there's massive murder. Actually, there's an interesting side point. Some people have argued that the almost like quasi-genocide that occurred on the streets of Paris against the workers almost in some sense set a mold of state violence, which was repeated all the way into the genocides of the 20th century, by the way. It's an interesting side point I was reading about recently. But the other thing that the Paris Commune showed Marx is that it's absolutely necessary for the working class to have leisure time. And so actually what's necessary is fighting for demands for the improvement in the quality of life of workers. So that becomes a big debate. And I myself am very obsessed with it because there's nothing that I hate more, speaking as somebody kind of from a working class background, than this notion that here we are as Marxists not caring about improving the quality of life of workers. I don't know what you think about that, but to me, it bothers me. Yes, I understand we are critical of the welfare state. I understand that. But at the same time, like, let's say immiseration is real and happening, and we don't have a solution to do anything about it, other than some mystical notion of a revolution. I would be opposed to that. I don't know what you think about that, guys. Aliyah, I feel like you might have thoughts on this. If you're
I mean, I would just basically agree with everything you're saying. I hate that rhetoric. I find it very upsetting. Yeah. I guess I don't have much to add. I think I pretty much just feel the same way about it as you do. It upsets me.
I apologize. It's very
No, that's okay.
idiosyncratic in a way. Takeen, please.
Yeah, I think we don't really need to well, I mean, it's a big statement to make, but like we don't really need to like look farther than Marx to see the reality of this situation, because Marx himself is sort of undercutting a lot of his own ideas by being like politically active. Like publishing the Communist Manifesto is a sort of is contradictory toward the manuscripts of 1848, even to Capital itself almost. I know like there's anachronisms there, but like there's many Marxes, right? Like there's the philosopher Marx, there's the economist Marx, there's the political Marx. Like you can even see, like if you read, that's why it's very concerning when you ever talk to someone. The most famous of them is the grand Jordan Peterson, who they say that they've only ever read the Communist Manifesto. And the Communist Manifesto is a piece of political, it's a pamphlet, right? it's not meant to critique as much as it's meant
Right.
to like create activity, create reactions, create create something, right?
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
we can
that's
see it within
it's
Marx himself.
well, it's true because like when Lassalle, Ferdinand Lassalle, who's the most famous German socialist of the time, for a while he was sort of opposed to this idea of bettering the working class condition, and he was kind of opposed to welfare in some sense. And he applied to become a member of the Communist League, the first like communist organization that Marx and Engels were a part of. And Marx actually liked Lassalle because he was charismatic and he thought he could be good for the movement. But he was denied membership precisely because he denied the notion of building the welfare of the working class,
Right.
which
And
I
if I
always
could,
found very interesting.
if it'd be okay for me to just cut in quick too. Yeah, it's true that he basically said that that was kind of the one thing Lassalle really did, was he had this kind of charisma that could really capture people, and that it had the capacity to really engage the working class in an almost emotional way, and how there was value to that, because it got the working class invested in their own kind of empowerment. And yeah, he worked with the League. There was the Communist Manifesto, but I think one thing that, of course, I have to point out that I think also gets lost along the way is like Marx did work on like concrete programs, and all of them were intended to specifically improve working conditions and quality of life for the working class, but not for the sake of just doing that. It was for that spiritual, intellectual, physical development, to give them the kind of free time to develop themselves in such a way that they then could organize in order to enact revolution. And that is like critical, really critical, I think.
It's so critical, and it's also about a theory of state power in relationship to um, the perspective of the working class's own demands and the refinement and the sort of like evolution of the sophistication of their demands. Anyways, we don't want to get into like critique of the Goethe program and all of that, but let's go to Luis for a counterpoint, please.
Oh, it's not necessarily a counterpoint. The one thing, I guess I mean, Aaliyah, you basically said my point. I was just gonna give like as a concrete example, like Marx's. I think he was really helpful in like creating like the minimum maximum program for the French Socialist Party. Um, and yeah, he like specifically like criticized Paul Lafargue, his I think what's his is he like it's like son-in-law, because he was saying like, oh man, we don't need reforms, we just need to get people like revved up, reforms are going to divert people from the struggle. And he says, yo, if that's what makes you a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist, that's crazy. So,
Nice. I appreciate that. Takeen, did you have another point?
No, it was just left over.
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, so we have about 5 minutes left. So basically what I want to do is go through, I mean, okay, so page 27, then onward, Marx really gets into quoting the Smith primarily, but also Say and Charles Lowden. He then gets into the section on called The Profit of Capital. And I noticed several things here that really felt like out of touch with the refined analysis of capital that he develops later. I could get into some of these points, but I think that a lot of it revolves around an absence in these pages of an adequate theory of how surplus is actually generated in capitalism. And there is a kind of vulgar idea of the worker as this beast that sort of is the engine of the production of all value, which is actually not what Marx says in Capital, by the way. Right? That's the kind of vulgar left Ricardian thing, which Andrew, loves Karatani. Karatani says that the early Marx has a vulgar left Ricardian in him, which proved problematic because what vulgar left Ricardianism does is that it pits an understanding of the overcoming of capitalism as a grand Hegelian master-slave dialectic, right? And it pits a kind of heroic working class against a capitalist class in an almost Manichean way. And that's what I'm kind of getting on these pages, And I think that Marx's Capital gives us a different conception than that, right? Like this is a real question about the two-class theory of the political Marx, right? Are we primarily to understand political antagonisms in their most elemental form in capitalism as driven by these antagonisms between there are other classes, but there are only two which truly for whose contestation is most decisive, right? For the possible overcoming or sublation of the system, right? So that's a real question I want us to think about. Is like, what do we make of the two-class theory in here? I think the other thing, yes, Connor.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on to that. Like when you said this is all reminiscent of a Hegelian master slave dialectic, that sounds absolutely true for me. Because I was just thinking of this question of recognition that's going on in these pages. It seems as though that it's certainly very central. Even going back to this point of like what is useful labor for the worker? That's a question of when is the worker recognized in society? And implicitly, then you could put it still another way, like when the worker is recognized is when he's doing something useful for the economy, right? And I think implied in this is a gesture towards, first of all, the human being is much more other than work. You know what I mean? And this gestures to, well, there are people in society who don't work, but nonetheless are valued. You know what I mean? And of course, those are the capitalists. And it's because they have money, they can cultivate their senses, their intellects, they're being human beings, that their choices are then recognized as legitimate and valuable, and so on. So it just brings up this like classic question, not only in Marx, but like Western Marxism, like how is it that we recognize useless activities, so to speak, right? This sort of thing. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I mean there is an homage here. I was noticing on page 39 to ecological Marxism, right? The advance made by human labor in converting the product of nature into the manufactured product of nature increases not the wages of labor, but in part the number of profitable capitals, and in the part the size of every subsequent capital in comparison with the foregoing. So the idea is that like capital is this bestial self-eating machine that only wreaks a sort of profit unto itself, and then foments a class war first amongst itself between large capitalists and small capitalists, and then isn't capable of seeing the misery that it engenders onto the working class. And in a sense, that actually means that the otherness, the otherness of the workers are occluded from the realm of civil society. Even they're thought of as equal within the realm of the polis, the citizenry, and so on. But I think Marx is trying to point to the fact that they exist as such a rabble bone of contention that well, it's not like somebody mentioned feudalism, dependency, slavery. I mean, we know from Marx's mature writings that this is not what capitalism is, and we should not understand capitalism this way. Marx actually, in most of his writings, will celebrate capitalism as accelerating out of those feudal dependencies. But still, nonetheless, in this text, we are hit with this kind of something closer to this. And I just wonder what folks think about that. I think we need to ask ourselves, like, how can we read Marx's unrefined political economic theory combined with his very sophisticated philosophical theory, which we're going to read next time? Like, how do we retain both? I think is the challenge of reading his text. And so, yes, and then he gets into the rent of land and the again, what is it? It's this huge internal schism amongst the rentier class and the landlords. So capitalism is this kind of like I don't know, like this whole panoply, this like sort of horizontal horror show of these intra-class rivalries and things like this. And there's a kind of but yet there is one class for whom those rivalries actually have the potential to overthrow the other system, the other classes, let's say. So guys, I think we'll wrap up very shortly. And let me just say, read before next time the Meseros introduction if you haven't already. It's so excellent. Where he gets into the 4 types of alienation that Marx develops in 1844 manuscripts. It's a good text to read maybe before, or if you prefer, after you read the next section, just to sort of get like a high level bearing on it. Because I think some of the stuff that's hard to deal with here is that Marx is actually making some quite grandiose philosophical claims. And so, yeah, enjoy it. And I mean, it's really good stuff, what we're going to read for next time. I would recommend finishing and starting on 69 here, Estranged Labor. Start there. And go through it slowly. We'll try to go through it slowly next time. I've given us like 2 or 3 sessions just to like work through that. This is next time is the bulk of the philosophical part. So that's when it's going to really get interesting. Yeah, does somebody need the PDF? You can go to the Patreon and get it. The link that I put at the very top of our chat, it's in there. It's not private, it's totally for the public.
Yeah, and if you go to LibGen and you just type in 1844 manuscripts, it's like the very first one that comes up. So, you know, if anyone wants to go that route.
Okay. Listen,
It's
thank you guys.
on the Marxist archives as well, the entire thing. But
Oh,
it's
cool. As a PDF?
Yeah, it's just a different translation though. It's not this translation.
Yes, Kent. Yes, I would recommend Kent. Thank you, Takeen, for sharing that. That's the PDF right there, guys. 18.10 megabytes. I would recommend a few things. Hal Draper's Marx's Revolutionary Theory, the 4 volumes, essential. Richard Hunt's The Political Ideas of Marx and Engels, also very good. Mikhail Lowy, The Young Marx, phenomenal. Phenomenal text. And then of course I'm always indebted to Kołakowski's The Main Currents of Marxism, which I think is one of the finest achievements Yes, please go ahead, Tony.
Hi, you just said that we're going to read starting from page 69 on estranged labor, but the
Yeah.
schedule on Patreon says pages like 20, 40 to 60.
What I'm recommending, actually, upon further reflection here, is that you read all of these sections on Marx's big block quotes and notes on political economy up to 68, but then begin to jump into the estranged labor section, because that's when things truly take off. That's when things truly take off. That's when the bulk of the text begins in a philosophical sense. So I can qualify that with an email or sort of a note, but I would just recommend for next time that we spend, like, read up to about 80. Like, I would say, like, 69 to 80, so we can start to get introduced to some of these. Can read the prior stuff, but again, my contention is that it's really sparse and somewhat kind of frustrating, in the sense that so much of Marx's sophisticated understanding of capital is like not present in that opening part. Does that make sense, Tony?
Yeah, thanks for that explanation.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope that works. Um Red Menace has a podcast on the manuscripts. Nice. Thank you. I've never listened to Red Menace. I'll have to do that.
I think Red Menace is pretty great. I think especially if you're just starting out and you kind of want just a general overview. Um yeah, they're pretty great, pretty comprehensive. They definitely have like a specific political angle with which, they take the text on, which might be different than some of ours. Like I think they're pretty classically MLM. But either way, like I think their material's great and it's just free to access. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Thank you, everybody. This was really great. Um, but yeah, like, read all of it, guys. But please, let's get into the estranged labor, because that's the meat of everything. So I'll send the note out or whatever to clarify. And we'll see you guys in 1 week. All right, thanks everybody. Peace
One
out.
question, Daniel. Sorry.
Yes, please, Kevin.
Yeah, have you had read Karl Marx writing on alienation, the compilation by Marcello Musso? He did this nice compilation.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
newer book, right? Yeah.
yeah, the newer book, and it has both, like, the earlier writing and excerpt from unpublished and other. Yeah, I wanted to know your thought about that. If
I
you,
need to check it out. I
yeah.
need to check it out. We should have him on the podcast. That'd be a good interview. He looks very interesting as a thinker. I just haven't actually pursued his work, but I will. If you recommend it, I will.
Yeah, I've read the introduction. Introduction was, I mean, super helpful, especially contextualizing the Marx in Marxism, specifically, like, since 1960s, the interest to alienation and so forth. I mean, it was helpful for in terms of contextualization of
Excellent.
the history of
I
ideas.
always get very worried when people make this claim that, like, there's Marx and Marxism, because I always worry that they're trying to negate the whole tradition of Marxism, like tout court, and I have always struggled with that, because I feel like when you do that, you perform an ideological reading on Marx as if you almost make him timeless, and you then dehistoricize Marx, where you say Marx is this kind of isolated thinker with these concepts, but don't trust any of his followers. And then,
Right.
of course, they do the same thing to Engels, which is even more criminal. But I don't think your friend is doing that, or this guy is doing that, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's not my friend. Like,
No, this author,
I've
this
just
author, yeah.
yeah, I've just skimmed through, his book. Yeah, I mean, maybe I would say
Maybe
maybe
a little.
to
I
some
know, I
extent.
know.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's helpful, and I was also
Marxism has a tradition, though, right? Like it has a tradition, and I mean, it's one thing to say, I like Aliyah just said, like I align with the Marxist-Leninist tradition, or I align with, a Trotskyist, or I align with a Mao, I align with X. I'm kind of for that, but I'm definitely not for this idea that like I reject all of it and I just think that I can isolate Marx. That's like the pinnacle of a kind of reduction that I'm not comfortable with. Because I then think that you do kneecap the political integrity of Marxism, if that makes sense, you know?
yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely makes sense. But I would say he is, I mean, helpful in this sense. Like, I mean, he grappled with this idea of late Marx. I mean, that's something, I mean, has happened, right? And any, serious consideration of any concept in Marx, I mean, in some points, if you are contextualizing, you are dealing, right? Like this idea that later Marx is good, early Marx just, no, it's not so. So this is something generated, and in the field, you end up, responding to this. And maybe one of the ramification of, engaging some of these deep, discussions, I mean, perpetuating, part of it. But I think he did a great job in arguing that's not really, I mean, not really, I mean, he tries to be it more give it more charitable reading, I think, in this sense. Anyhow, just
Yeah, I'm sure it's good. I'm definitely excited to check it out. Very good, guys. Okay, until next time then, okay? Take care, everybody.